Robert Hariman and John Louis Lucaites are the authors of No Caption Needed, the book I just mentioned. Iconic Photographs, Public Culture and Liberal Democracy, a book and a blog, so nocaptionneeded.com. Each dedicated to discussion of the role that photojournalism and other visual practices play in a vital democratic society. Robert Hariman is a professor in the program of Rhetoric and Public Culture, Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University, and is the author of Political Style, The Artistry of Power. It's been recently translated by Le Pouvoir du Style. I know that Robert knows French a bit through Latin. This is what he told me. But your book speaks French as they are translated. So, and John Louis Lucaites is professor of rhetoric and public culture in the Department of Communication and Culture at Indiana University and an adjunct professor of American Studies. He is co-author of Crafting Equality, America's Anglo-African World. La conférence d'aujourd'hui a pour titre The Post-Cold War Nuclear Optic, How We Learned to Stop Worrying and See the Bomb. So I would invite, I think today this Robert is talking. Yesterday that was John Louis. They share their responsibility to speak to the people. So they were lecturing yesterday at Concordia in the Speaking Photography lecture series. So we're very pleased, Martha Langford and I, to both welcome them in Montreal to this at these two venues.
Okay, thank you. Between text and image and English and French, somehow we'll stumble through here. But it is indeed an honor and a pleasure to be here in this conference and your university in this wonderful city. And we appreciate this very much. I do apologize, both John and I are hopelessly Anglophone, and I'm sorry about that. I may read too fast at times, but please feel free to talk later in the conference if you wish, as we can continue our conversation. By the end of 1945, the death toll from dropping an atomic bomb on Hiroshima had reached 140,000. The victims had been vaporized, blown apart, melted, burned, flayed, lacerated, crushed, irradiated, and otherwise destroyed. Thousands more survived but were blinded, maimed, scarred, debilitated by radiation sickness, or emotionally traumatized, and more deaths would follow. These casualties were compounded by the obliteration of the city's infrastructure and by the second, more powerful attack on Nagasaki 3 days after Hiroshima. Sadly, these events are notable but not exceptional when compared to the scale of destruction set in World War II. And reasonable people argue that the bombings involved no violation of the moral calculus of a war started by Japan and pursued with extraordinary brutality. Nonetheless, the first use of atomic weaponry was a moment of historical significance and ethical anxiety. The efficiency of mass destruction had increased exponentially and was effectively limitless. The scale of destruction strained the moral imagination, and the new technology created near total separation between the agents and victims of destruction. As that distance could facilitate continued and ultimately suicidal use of the new technology, the question arose and remains of how to communicate both the destructiveness and moral dangers of nuclear weapons. The problems of representation that accompany any war were compounded in the case of atomic warfare. The attacks were without warning. They literally obliterated people and property. Documentation on the ground was severely compromised, and the victors wrote the history. In addition, the secrecy enveloping the military technology, its aura of scientific achievement, and the mechanized efficiency of the weapon encouraged elite management of every phase of its use, including documentation of its effects. Even so, the destructive power of the bomb could not be hidden. Unlike the wastage typical of war, the bomb was spectacular. Its unusual destructive capacity came with a corresponding innovation in the visual field, the towering cloud of smoke and flame created by the explosion. A big gun or a line of ships at sea can impress, but they remain within the scale of ordinary life. A pillar of fire thousands of feet high carries the imagination into the realm of the supernatural, as with Robert Oppenheimer's oft-quoted reference to Shiva, destroyer of worlds. Visual representation became crucial to identifying and understanding the new weapon and to managing public opinion regarding its use. Visual documentation of the two bombings of Japan fell largely into 5 categories. First, the photographs of the mushroom cloud suspended in the air thousands of feet above the cities. Second, photos of the unexploded bombs as well as the planes that delivered them, along with the air crews, military brass, and representative scientists. 3, panoramic shots of either cityscape reduced to rubble on a still evident grid pattern. 4, fragmentary images of destruction at ground level, such as ordinary objects melted almost beyond recognition, and human shadows burnt onto surfaces, another aesthetic innovation, silhouettes created by detonation. And finally, photographs of individual corpses contorted from their immolation, or of the scarred, shredded, seared flesh of still living burn victims. These last photographs surely qualify as images of atrocity, and that may be why they are seen the least. By contrast, the images of small scenes of property damage have little emotional resonance, nor do the distant panoramic photographs, which testify only to generic destruction and could be labeled Chicago Fire of 1871 without much loss of meaning. Similarly, the technocratic tableaus displace horror with a very different mood that comes from public relations campaigns on behalf of progressive development of modern civilization. Were it a contest between the images of horrific suffering and these more familiar depictions, moral unease would be palpable, and it would be difficult to accept the verdict that such weapons were ever justified. Nuclear atrocity remains largely outside of public awareness, however. Initially, this inattention was due in part to censorship or limited circulation of the most horrific images, but the same could be said of the Holocaust photographs that subsequently shook modernity to its foundations. By contrast, public moral reflection about nuclear warfare is difficult because the relevant field of representation has been dominated by the iconic image of the nuclear explosion, and with that, a Cold War nuclear optic that limits what we can see and imagine. Stated more baldly, the iconic photograph of the mushroom cloud is not a direct representation of atrocity, but rather a condensation symbol of modern destructiveness that anchors a comprehensive strategy of moral containment. The simple but effective substitution of a secondary effect for the devastated city became, through an intensive series of iterations, a sustained pattern of moral avoidance. The mushroom cloud displaces the atrocity of its actual use and facilitates citizen compliance with the national security state. It cannot do so seamlessly, however. Images become iconic because they can mediate fundamental tensions within a society, and the bomb exposed serious contradictions in modernity itself. Most notably, atrocity now could refer not only to localized exceptions to moral order, but also to military strategies for civilian destruction supported by society's most powerful institutions. The dilemma soon became all too evident in the defensive strategy of mutually assured destruction. The atomic image was a revelation whose meaning remained unclear, not least because the mushroom cloud has been, from the start, an image about the future. By tracking the image from 1945 to the present, we hope to demonstrate briefly how the icon emerged, constituted a dominant mode of public spectatorship, and now is being reworked to address characteristic anxieties about politics and death in the 21st century. So the next section of the paper is entitled Constructing the Icon. An atomic bomb was dropped in Hiroshima on August 6. 3 days later, a second was dropped in Nagasaki. Photographs of the two bombs exploding were not released by the military until August 11th and were relegated exclusively to the back pages of national newspapers. Indeed, not a single U.S. newspaper or magazine put either photograph on its front page or cover, a somewhat incredible fact given both the world historical status attributed to the event, almost immediately recognized as the beginning of a new age, and the technological uniqueness of the images themselves. Photographs of both bombs were eventually featured in Time and Life magazine in their August 20th issues, and in each instance they were framed within a rhetoric of ambivalence that was to play a central role in the subsequent history of the two photographs. and in particular, the one depicting the explosion over Nagasaki. In time, for example, the two photographs are reduced in size and triangulated with a picture of the statue of Prometheus, his liver being consumed by Zeus's winged hound. The caption reads, "Progress has a price." The price, however, does not appear in the photographs, which without captioning and context might have appeared more akin to abstract art than anything suggesting collective immolation. In addition, the Promethean frame neatly shifts moral resonance from history to myth and from Christian to pagan ethics. And because Prometheus was punished for giving humans fire, implies that nuclear power has become equally irreversible and important for civilization. Life provided another equally ambivalent framing of the two photographs. Although using 2 full pages for the images, they were preceded by a full-page illustrator's rendition of the explosion at Hiroshima, showing clouds of dust expanding over the recognizable city with the plane flying away from the explosion in the background. For Life, which otherwise relied upon the rhetorical power of photographic realism, these photographs needed to be contextualized as an ordinary act of war, and subsequent before and after aerial photographs of the bombing reinforced the point, virtually obscuring the devastating magnitude of the destruction, even as the written text noted that, quote, "the atomic bomb had blown 3/5 of Hiroshima off the face of the earth." And there you can see what was on the facing page. It's one thing to blow up a city. It's another to ensure that American children are well fed. In short, the initial visual representation of atomic warfare was artistically modest, morally ambivalent, tilted toward abstraction and ethical justification, and not yet anchored in any one medium or image. This haziness and its subsequent resolution were prefigured in the photographs of the two mushroom clouds. The Hiroshima cloud appears unimpressive. An irregular form, already dissipating in the winds, shot from above, it fits too easily into conventional images of smoke emanating from a cannon or a big bomb, rather than a new, exponentially powerful force. Perhaps more worrisome, as it is blowing away, one's attention begins to shift back to the city below. By contrast, the image of the second explosion is the first instance of what became the iconic image. The symmetrical form reaching towards the heavens, transfixing the spectator's gaze on nothing but the blast upward. Vincent Leo and Peter Hayes have independently charted the ways in which the initial photographs were transformed in the public imagery from grainy, ill-defined clouds of smoke into what today we recognize as the mushroom cloud. And that name emerged only gradually, as any number of other metaphors were also attempted. As that happened, the image of the mushroom cloud consolidated a discourse of nuclear warfare that was an important part of Cold War public culture. That discourse included the doomsday clock, duck and cover drills for school children, civil defense shelter signs, celebrity status for prominent physicists, promotional journalism of the nuclear arsenal, and other articulations as well. Most important, however, was the emergence of the mushroom cloud as a photographic icon. The key moment of visual condensation was the publication of photographs of controlled explosions in the Bikini Atolls in 1946. As Peter Hales has suggested, the key aesthetic feature of the nuclear test explosions is their evocation of the sublime. This aesthetic highlights the simultaneous experience of beauty and terror, and of a sense of awe that risks the annihilation of the self in the power of nature. The sublime is a structured experience, however, as it gives one a sense of danger without actually having to take the risk. And the pleasures comes from exceeding a limit on experience while actually remaining on this side of that divide. The photographs of the mushroom cloud depend on each of these conventions. The viewer is drawn close to the magnificent, beautiful, annihilating power released by the bomb, and yet is also safely removed from it. Now even the precipice is invisible, as it has been replaced by the state-sponsored and controlled technocratic platform of a military aircraft. The representative spectator is gone as well, replaced by the sheer transparency of the camera's lens. Thus, the mushroom cloud provides an experience of the sublime now fused with modern technology that both produces and records an eruption of terrifying yet awe-inspiring power. The sense of danger was sublimated further by locating the nuclear tests in an expansive and primitive landscape, an Edenic setting in which nature and culture were visually articulated in near-perfect harmony. As nature and technology were fused, society, not just those who would be victims, but all social complications, became reduced, remote, and finally invisible. By setting the test blasts, and note you can still see some vestiges of society in this photograph, and that will disappear over time. By setting the test blasts in magnificent natural tableaus, such as the Marshall Islands or still later in Nevada's Yucca Flats, the scene was set for focusing ever more intently on the towering cloud at the center of every photograph and nothing else. And so we turn to anchoring the optic. The bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki not only marked the end of World War II, but also were the operative beginning of the Cold War. And it quickly became apparent that unleashing the atom was a potentially horrifying engagement with modernity's gamble, the paradoxical relationship between risk and progress that defines industrialized society. Everyone recognized that, quote, the genie could not be put back in the bottle, another pagan metaphor that this one promoted by Disney, and that images of our friend the atom and its capacity for catastrophic destruction had thus to be managed in a manner that would fit with the rapid growth of the then nascent military-industrial complex and the national security state. The emergence of the iconic image provided an essential recontextualization of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one that consolidated the initial attempts at managing moral ambivalence about the weapon. The image would reframe large-scale atrocity as impersonal destructiveness viewed from the vantage of sheer spectatorship. And its iconic circulation would relay that mode of perception throughout public culture. Thus, the iconic image of the mushroom cloud embodied a Cold War nuclear optic. This optic is activated by the coordination of three key features of design. First, the structured absence of death and destruction. Second, the formal perfection of the explosion. And third, the containment of the bomb within a closed circuit of military control. And we'll turn to each of these now in turn. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki photographs were, of course, oriented towards such an optic. Absent any reference to people or culture per se, the photographs underscore the unleashing of a natural force beyond imagination, even as they mask the devastating effect that occurred on the ground. Indeed, what we see in each instance is not the explosion itself, but its after effect. Thus, the atomic image is simultaneously showing and not showing the destructive force wrought by the explosion. The huge cloud of exploding gases is unmistakably the real effect of the weapon detonating, and yet it completely displaces the scenes of human destruction that are also the real effect and the primary intention of the weapon. The structured absence was only partially achieved in the Hiroshima photos, became formally secure in the Nagasaki image, and was reproduced continuously in subsequent photographs. A few photographs, for example showing U.S. soldiers near the blast site, suggested that actual bodies might be involved, but they were the exception. Likewise, the occasional disclosures of actual harm, as was caused by radiation raining down upon Japanese fishermen working in the area of the Marshall Islands, could not repopulate what had become a tableau of pure energy. This absence of human suffering is consistent with the spectator's experience, which mutes moral responsiveness. The towering cloud creates a profound disconnect between the spectator and whatever happened before the blast and whatever has happened beneath it. All sense of cause, proportion, or complicity is obliterated by the incredible power unleashed from a single bomb, and hundreds of thousands could be dying below, but the spectator sees only smoke and sky. Most important, the image is wholly disembodied. There are neither people nor a familiar mise-en-scène of embodied social interaction to ground one's moral encounter with the image. Perhaps this absence motivates the mythic bodies that are conjured up in verbal captions for the image. Moreover, we are disembodied ourselves. Close enough to witness the bomb's power, we are subject neither to the force of the explosion nor the fiery shock waves that are produced as its most immediate and devastating effects. Beauty and horror are thus combined safely in a spectacle of technological achievement and prowess, even as its moral costs are erased. This spectacular advantage was matched by the formal perfection of the mushroom cloud. We see it clearly in the photographs of the Nagasaki explosion, where the visual aesthetic coordinates multiple registers of representation. On the vertical axis, we have the dark billowing plume that extends from outside of the bottom of the frame through an interceding cloud at the midpoint, from which it blossoms forth in a tapered and almost perfectly symmetrical mushroom. That the lower rank of the plume is dark and opens up into a brighter and whiter cloud invokes a compelling balance to the grayscale tones of the image, locating the ultimate expression of the force of the explosion in the more positive glow and dispersion of light. By the time we get to the photographs that emanate from the subsequent tests in the Christmas Islands or at Yucca Flats, the symmetrical perfection of the explosions was even more pronounced. The several bases for formalization of the image each underwent progressive refinement over time. The photographs became representations of ultimate, almost transcendental power, an unstoppable unleashing of cosmic force, and yet simultaneously controlled and well-ordered as if unfolding according to natural laws that were at once true, good, and beautiful. The trunk of the explosion became an ever greater column of concentrated force. The fireball erupting upwards became the symmetrical capital to the column, decoratively varied within that circle only enough to suggest the writhing energies within, and the whole ascension continued upward amidst a glowing aura of light and color radiating outward. Often the pillar of smoke and fire extended up through a layer of clouds that provided a softly hued mood of a landscape painting, and sometimes the blast created its own intermediate ring of cloud as if it were making the sky as it unfolded upward. Obviously, in our account, the iconic image of the mushroom cloud is not any one photograph, but a composite image that remains in the mind's eye after seeing hundreds of versions of the same. In fact, this is a feature of more than one iconic photograph, and it is particularly so with the bomb. The Challenger icon emerges from the combination of spectacular photography and continuous circulation of nearly identical images that exist primarily to mark a general condition rather than a specific event. Also note that the iconic image draws primarily from the explosion of strategic weapons. The tactical nukes produced images that often were messier, always smaller, placed uneasily within settings that were too close to the scale, familiarity, and fallibility of ordinary life. Paradoxically, the massive size of the nuclear explosion may have been a source of reassurance, one sign of a larger process of containment. This emphasis on the containment of the bomb within a closed circuit of military control rounds out the Cold War nuclear optic. The immediate concern following the end of the war, of course, was that others, such as the Russians, would gain access to the technology and thus challenge American hegemony. The logic of the Cold War, of course, was to stay one step ahead with more, bigger, and more destructive weapons, and accomplishing this relied in no small measure on containing and controlling the bomb within a nuclear military-industrial complex. The hundreds of photographs of nuclear explosions that emerged in the 1950s and which were regularly published in places like Life magazine emphasized that the bomb was in the custodianship of scientists and technicians guided by a disciplined, well-organized military. Indeed, full interpretation of the iconic image requires that it can be seen as an anchor for a host of other images of the equipment, testing facilities, technocratic personnel, and command centers that made up the nuclear weapons complex. None of these other images could have had much purchase visually or otherwise but for the iconic image of the blast. But what were banal, often posed photographs of inert materials and settings acquired a secondary residence as markers of the system of control. The iconic image generated these other images, which in turn framed the icon to minimize the moral problem that came from its being an instrument for large-scale destruction of civilian populations. It is interesting to note how the temporality of the nuclear icon became emblematic of this closed circuit, which was in turn reinforced by the formal perfection enveloping the structured absence. In short, each iteration of the icon referred back to the original representation of the bomb, which became the photograph from Nagasaki with its now easily recognizable mushroom cloud. After all, the significance of the blast derived from the historical fact of its use, and so each test of the technology was an extension of the originary event. Because each subsequent blast was a test, however, it served to lessen the sense of actual historically specific harm, including the original devastation. Moreover, the Nagasaki image came to refer forward to the subsequent refinement of the technology. It was, after all, the birth of the atomic age, rather than backward to the atrocity it had effaced. Every image of a nuclear blast now is a march forward from that prior event on the road to progress and security. The images themselves thus constituted a closed circuit of reference that helped to efface memory of what had been, ensure moral insularity, and reinforce compliance with Cold War doctrine. A photograph that began as a blurred mark of military victory in a world war was thus transformed into an icon for the normalization of a new technology and a new political order. Images of the suffering caused by the bomb were to appear, albeit very infrequently and much later, but their moral purchase was consistently overshadowed by the photographs of an aesthetically contained, technocratically controlled nuclear test explosion that precluded any experience of atrocity. The ever more perfect mushroom clouds represented enormous destructive power, but in the abstract. Indeed, the bomb epitomized the abstraction characterized in modernist aesthetics. It harnessed not only the power of the atom, but also a dominant cultural mentality of the time to symbolize the magnificence of American power. Icons endure via adaptation, however, and changes in both geopolitics and U.S. public culture are reflected in, and perhaps advanced by, new uses of the iconic image. And so now we would like to turn very briefly to consider what's happening with image and optic after the Cold War. And I recognize that presumes the Cold War is over, and of course it's not entirely over. Okay, but we know what post means nowadays. Iconic photographs provide widely influential examples of how images are appropriated by retailers, advertisers, artists, advocates, and many other participants in the patterns of circulation that constitute public culture. Appropriations of the mushroom cloud were prominent in the early years of the Cold War as the cultural power of the bomb was distributed through advertising, B-movies, and other media. Such examples range from the sublime to the ridiculous and to the garish, absurd, and just downright tacky. As Vicki Goldberg notes, there was an atomic cab company, the atomic cocktail, the atomic hairdo arranged on a wire form. By 1947, there were 45 companies in the Manhattan phone book with the word atomic in their titles, including the Atomic Undergarment Company. And many had a sweet, puffy little mushroom cloud as their logo. Topps bubblegum stickers, atomic fireball candy, and many other examples fill out the list. Perhaps the apotheosis came with the famous Daisy ad, which aired during the 1964 presidential campaign between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. As the ad begins, a young girl sits in a field picking the petals off a daisy while counting them. When she gets to 9, a strong male voiceover begins a countdown from 10 as the camera moves in closer and closer to the girl's face, and eventually her eyes become the screen, which witnesses a bright flash of detonation and a mushroom cloud erupting upwards. You can download the ad, by the way. The ad was embargoed after one airing amidst criticism that it was excessively frightening and politically unfair. The controversy, however, soon abated as both Johnson's electoral landslide and images of nuclear terror were forgotten after the president doubled down on a conventional war in Vietnam. Equally important, the ratification of the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963 eliminated the atmospheric testing that provided the mushroom cloud photographs. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968, and in the U.S. subsequent presidencies were defined by oil crises and conflicts with non-nuclear states, as well as comprehensive social change at home, while the Cold War devolved into détente, arsenal reductions, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. It should not be surprising, then, that iconic photographs of the bomb would seem increasingly dated. What is surprising, however, as far as we can tell, is that images of the bomb have been largely absent despite the emergence of terrorism as a new geopolitical threat that includes regular discussion of weapons of mass destruction, renegade scientists, nuclear weapons production by avowed adversaries, the smuggling of enriched uranium and nuclear warheads, and tactical nuclear attacks on U.S. cities executed by dirty bombs delivered via shipping containers. This relative absence is surprising, as anxiety about the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe is arguably more valid today than perhaps any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet, outside of a few editorial cartoons, which have always used such images, the mainstream press has not. Why? Two overlapping answers come to mind. One is that the pattern denial of the Cold War optics still dominates public representation. In this regard, the controversy over the 1995 Enola Gay exhibition in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum is particularly illustrative. The original exhibit would have included documentation of the suffering caused by the bomb, whereas the eventual compromise restored the structured absence of the Cold War optic. This was a big public controversy at the time in the U.S. Tellingly, in place of depictions of the human damage wrought by the bomb, the exhibit supplied documentation of the making of the exhibit, a technocratic diversion that, while a staple of contemporary exhibit decline, and probably for the same reasons, reinforced a closed circuit of administrative control, presented as competent problem solving, and returned the public gaze to the sleek surfaces of the airplane. Thus, the exhibit, coming not only at the 50th anniversary of the Hiroshima bombing, but also 7 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, set out to move past the confines of the Cold War optic, and then was bullied back into compliance with that visual regime. We have little doubt that such habits of suppression continue, just as do many Cold War institutions. That said, we want to suggest a second answer to the question, which is that the relative absence of the iconic image is one part of a new transitional post-Cold War optic. That optic would be evident from appropriations of the iconic image in an array of media extending beyond typical news and commentary, and it would be available only in part. In short, we want to point towards something on the order of a shift in public consciousness regarding nuclear weapons and perhaps modern catastrophe more generally. On the one hand, representations of the bomb have been noticeably absent in precisely those places at which we would expect to see them featured. On the other hand, the iconic image is reappearing, albeit in new configurations that suggest the emergence of a different optic for visualizing nuclear war. Images of the bomb are now showing up with some frequency in what might be considered odd places, at least from the perspective of the national security state. Take, for example, the Atomic Store, which began as a distributor for a 1995 documentary film, but now offers T-shirts, coffee mugs, paperweights, and other collectibles festooned with mushroom clouds or radiation symbols, such as playing cards, postcards, and a book titled How to Photograph an Atomic Bomb. For the weekend photographer, no doubt. Other online gift shops are available as well, such as the one at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History, which is a completely promotional institution. Although nuclear weaponry has been a part of popular culture from the mid-1940s, the differences are starting to become evident. The mushroom cloud is both historicized and individualized, making it appear either interned in the past or merely a piece of pop culture iconography to be used for hip accessorizing. The commodified images from popular culture are more ironic or transgressive than was in the past, when simple identification with technological power was the norm in both folk culture and civic promotion. Likewise, artistic use is now more tilted toward odd associations and cultural commentary than the earnest, admonitory realism of anti-nuclear advocacy. The artist Mac Popesky, for example, couples mushroom clouds with Disney characters and rabbits in business suits, and so forth. And a theatrical poster for a play about radiation sickness features one part of a mushroom cloud, a trisection close enough that the fire inside is visible. In these and other works, the iconic image is still there, but fragmented or reframed. The structured absence is breaking down, and the circuit of control is shown to include more of the society than it is comfortable to admit, and to be adequate to contain the terror of nuclear attack. Remember how Disney was part of the promotional apparatus and strategy of containment, and here it's being brought into the picture, for example. To get a better sense of how a new optic might be emerging from the gradual deterioration of the old, one need look no farther than a New York Times story about the debut of fashion photography at the 2007 Miami Beach Art Photo Expo. In other words, not a place you'd expect to see a mushroom cloud. Titled "Work With Me, Baby," the article leads off with a photograph by fashion photographer Seb Janiak. The photograph, which very clearly puts the bomb back into the public eye, sat on the front page of the Times website for the better part of the day on which it appeared. It was an advertisement for the accompanying story that, by the way, never once mentions the photograph. On its face, the photograph is both an artistic challenge to the prevailing optic and something of a response to contemporary anxiety about the immediate possibilities of nuclear war. In place of the structured absence, the target of destruction is now evident as we witness the immolation of an actual city, and Los Angeles, not to be too, right? The formal perfection of the explosions is retained in some measure, but also complicated by there being 3 explosions, no one of them in the center of the frame, and they also appear miniaturized and perhaps retouched. Instead of a single iconic image dominating the pictorial space, now the bombs are but differentiated events within a larger landscape. Notice also that culture, the city, and nature, the promontory from beyond which the viewer witnesses the scene, are here separated from one another rather than unified as in the eye-level views of high blasts in the older photos or in the title of the book 100 Suns. The mood is different as well, as the cool, richly saturated blue sky dotted with puffy white cumulus clouds stands in stark opposition to the Cold War optic, which featured in either high contrast black and whites, or that underscored the violent disruption and force of the bomb, or the color photographs, which were heavily dominated in red and orange hues that signified the overwhelming heat and beauty of the blast. Now the image is imbued with the artificial colors of a tourist postcard. Finally, there are not 1 but 3 explosions, and perhaps more coming, which operate outside of the closed circuit of military control. The key point, of course, is that the prior Cold War nuclear optic is no longer adequate, if it ever was, to the potential problems we face. And yet those problems have not gone away for the absence of a compelling image. And so what is the newer optic we are being offered, and what are its implications? The answer here is a bit more difficult to discern. We have to start by noticing that the photograph is not just a challenge to the optic, but to the realist aesthetic that underwrites the documentary assumptions of photojournalism in general. What we are witnessing is a possible, not actual event framed from the perspective of a not too distant future. It is thus inherently allegorical, a fictional and hyper-realistic pastiche of at least 5 competing and overlapping codes. First is the code of the bomb itself. The explosions could be directly out of the Cold War optic, albeit reduced by their displacement across the landscape. They do not dominate, however. If anything takes up the pictorial space, it is the city, a modernist codification of the work of survey geographers of the 1950s and 1960s. It offers an almost grid-like representation of a complex social and political event or environment for the benefit of institutional observation and control from a safe distance. The cityscape then is sutured with a 3rd code that recalls the natural sublime that we noted above, except now the viewer has been returned to an actual precipice that anyone might access rather than an invisible platform in the sky. The individual sitting in the foreground, high above the city, invokes 2 additional codes for viewing the photograph. On the one hand, we have a high fashion model, someone we are more likely to find in the pages of Vogue, ultramodern, and aloof. At the same time, however, she is encoded as the gothic post-human superhero one might find in a futuristic graphic novel looking down on the dystopian city. So as opposed to the modernist aesthetic within the nuclear optic, here we have 5 codes, an allegorical relationship, non-hierarchical relationship to one another in this composition. The combined effect of this surplus of signification is a picture of excess, catastrophe, and ambivalent spectatorship. The photograph invokes a sense of the sublime, but the source of that sublimity is no longer the bomb and its magnificence or ferocity. Rather, it seems to emanate from the cityscape and its capacity as a technology to withstand the multiple explosions as if they were an ordinary and everyday event. The question for us has to be, what's going on here? In one sense, the image is a step forward as it challenges both the image culture of the Cold War and the apparent cultural amnesia that has largely suppressed images of nuclear atrocity. And yet the alternative that it offers as a primary replacement seems to draw from the world of high fashion, a point underscored by the title. Work with me, baby. These are the words of avant-garde fashion photographers working fast and furious to capture a soft porn aesthetic that can be published in magazines. And so one has to wonder, is this image one step closer to Walter Benjamin's terrible prophecy that our self-annihilation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order? Or is it a cautionary tale designed to warn us against our own political indifference? After all, it is unlikely that fashion models will really save us from nuclear war. Rather than perverse spectatorship, the fashion model superhero could well be an inversion of Benjamin's allegory of the Angelus Novus. According to Benjamin, the angel's back is turned to the future as he contemplates the wreckage of history accumulating from the storm of progress blowing from paradise. By contrast, the postmodern angel observes the wreckage occurring within paradise itself, Los Angeles, in some future and perhaps not distant time. The viewer is positioned in the past, temporarily untouched by actual explosions radiating from the city, but still on the precipice. The mood is apocalyptic, a moment of revelation. But of what? Not, it seems, of atrocity as we ordinarily understand it. In place of the body in pain, we see a fashion model. And yet the image does make nuclear war thinkable, and not as a fantasy of grand strategy, but as a site of victimage. If there still is a structured absence, and there is, it is within a scene that has become mildly, disturbingly parodic, which is another sign that assurances of perfection and control are things of the past. To conclude, we have argued elsewhere that images of atrocity need not be maximally horrific to be morally and politically effective. Iconic photographs of war and violence typically do not depict suffering as directly as other images of the time, even in some cases on the same roll of film. They succeed, however, because they supply something at least as valuable for public judgment and action, signifiers of a structure of relationships that give the viewer a basis for speaking against the state. Throughout the Cold War, the iconic image of the mushroom cloud articulated another structure, a Cold War nuclear optic that recognized neither actual harm nor the public sphere, that offered instead an amoral realm of abstraction and state control. By contrast, the post-Cold War nuclear optic is a mixed bag in every sense, but is partially redeemed by its affinity with fragmentation. Atrocity may never be revealed fully, but now, perhaps, some of the time, in some settings, it need not benefit from the last century's visual conventions for collective amnesia. Thank you.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Première question? Oui, juste ici. Attends, peut-être Myrna, voilà, devant, merci beaucoup.
Oh, thanks. Hi, my name is Adrian, and I am as a professionally, my profession is a Byzantine iconographer. And to me, when I heard you spoke a lot about iconic images, and in my profession, I understand iconic images as when I paint my icons, following the Byzantine tradition, images are representing somewhere between the realistic world and the abstract world. And that allows the viewer to engage, in a religious way, or, to have some sacred feelings or whatever. Well, I'm just curious about this photograph, because in this photograph, it's so, because you use photography, like the artists use photography, and I see, images like this all the time. Hollywood movies can do even better than this, let's say. So it's hard for me to, as a viewer, to engage with this, because this image kind of gives me almost everything. Doesn't let my imagination to, obviously I like the colors and everything, but like in Byzantine iconography, what I'm saying that the image doesn't give you everything. Let's say the characters representing in the icon are not a certain person, so it led me to kind of engage with that image and have some spiritual experiences. But here everything is laid out for me, and I was wondering, how do you think about the viewers in relation to this image? How do they? One more thing I want, like in the Byzantine world, we are speaking about a symbolic, realistic approach to the image. In this case, I see it more as a realistic, so I want to know your thoughts on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. First of all, this is not an iconic image. Okay. This is a allegorical, parodic reworking. It's an appropriation of an icon, not the iconic image itself. That's the first point. Second of all, our understanding of iconic photo images in photojournalism has some similarities with the Byzantine icon, but for the most part is a different animal. Okay, in that the modern public art did not evolve out of the Byzantine tradition. It came out of the Christian West and so forth, and so there are many differences, and we don't want to say it's simply a secularization or something or extension of the Byzantine icon, because that's not how that works. However, the key similarity in respect to your question is that the photojournalistic icon is not merely realistic. It is a means for activating an imagination. Okay? That the imagination is not religious, it's political. So the iconic image does show you a literal or historical moment, but in a way that is activating, okay, a certain kind of, political imagination, and that's where the real value is. And then we try to understand how that works. Okay, so now, in terms of that said, a merely realistic hermeneutic, okay, or a highly reductive hermeneutic, the way John Tagg thinks, so forth, is not going to work. It's not going to adequately explicate. Okay, that was for you, Martha. Is not going to adequately explicate the image. Okay, and so our own strategy was to valorize allegory as a hermeneutical practice somewhat, even though it's a bit of a mismatch in some of these. Now, here it works. Now, and the difference is we don't really know how, we're not adequately trained to read allegorical paintings because they haven't been the dominant aesthetic, okay, within the last 100 years and so forth. In fact, there was, a very marginal position. But I think we have other work on this. I think, in fact, we're seeing more and more allegorical composition. We are, in fact, becoming, I think it's one of the master tropes of postmodern culture. We are becoming more habituated to it. The key thing here, one of the key, or sort of the two key things to mention about an allegorical composition in this respect is, one, the multiple coding. Okay, that's not organized. I mean, modernist compositions can have multiple codes, but there's a hierarchy, and you know how to read them accordingly. Here, there's no hierarchy. Is the Gothic something that should come for or after the cityscape? You don't know. Okay. The second key thing is that allegorical spectatorship involves a mobile viewer, someone who knows that he or she can move around in the image, can start with one code or another and go from there. And I think this encourages such a mobile optic. So part of knowing how to read it is making a decision as to where to start. Okay. Do you really want to read it through fashion or through the fashion model? Do you really want to read it through the Gothic code? So forth. Do you want to read it through the Sublime? The image we forgot to throw in here is the famous one of, Casper's, standing in the sea of fog, and this is, I think, a direct replication of that. So here, the viewer is standing on the precipice, looking out, and that's then the sort of fundamental depiction of where the spectator stands in the Sublime experience. Okay, and one of the things we notice with the bomb photographs is the precipice itself is erased. You're just there in this military aircraft that you don't see either in this godlike vantage at 30,000 feet to see this thing. Whereas here, you're back down in it. So, long story short, the mushroom cloud is an icon. This is an appropriation of the icon, throwing it into an allegorical composition that involves multiple coding and a mobile and therefore somewhat disturbing spectatorship, which is why your reaction is, I think, indicative. It's kind of just, you don't quite know what to do.
Two more questions. D'abord Bertrand Gervais et ensuite Jean-Pierre Montier.
So Bertrand Gervais, thank you very much for your presentation. It was quite revealing. I have two remarks. One is more of an anecdote than anything else, but you'll see where it goes. Two winters ago, I went to Los Alamos to see the museum where you had the Manhattan Project, and at the entry of the city, you had this this big rock with it said Los Alamos. I have to remember it correctly, where discoveries are made. So eventually I took a picture of myself in front of that sign. But it was fascinating for me to see that, okay, well, I went there because this is where the atomic bomb was created. And then you had you had the feeling that the city did not want its responsibility in that manner to be known. So you didn't have where the atomic bomb was created, but basically where discoveries, in plural, were made. So I think it has to do with the first part of your paper about, the responsibility and how the United States reacted to the first, to the explosion. So that's...
Just to highlight that, there's a nice study of the all the promotional filmmaking, the so-called documentary filmmaking that was done by the Department of Defense and others and so forth. And the argument is that the nuclear testing was consistently portrayed as a scientific rather than a military enterprise. That this was the advancement of knowledge,
exactly,
not the development of ever more powerful weaponry.
Okay, and you're working on the icon of the mushroom cloud. It's interesting to know that at the very beginning, before we had the mushroom as the premier icon, you had different ways of identifying the cloud. First you had the broccoli, then you had the brain. It took a while before the idea of the mushroom as the image and the metaphor to pinpoint that form was established. And Don DeLillo in Underworld plays a lot with the idea of, where does the mushroom come from? Both the salient, positive and negative aspects of the mushroom comes into place. I was wondering if you, in your work, you also deal with this aspect of the symbolic or mythic dimension to the mushroom as the metaphor to pinpoint that form.
Yeah, Underworld's a very good book, by the way. I highly recommend it. But no, because that's been done. Okay, and what? Vincent Leo nailed that, and so we're just trying to go to the next step. But that's the book. Yeah.
Jean-Pierre.
Je vais vous poser, donc Jean-Pierre Montier, je vais vous poser ma question en français, ce sera plus facile pour moi et peut-être pour vous une fois que Vincent aura été assez aimable pour la traduire, et je vais faire très court. Vous avez évidemment limité le corpus des images extrêmement intéressantes aux champignons, à la bombe atomique, etc. Je me suis demandé si ce corpus-là n'est pas éventuellement articulable avec celui des décollages de fusées. Et si d'une certaine façon, y compris d'ailleurs jusqu'à Challenger qui explose en vol, ou jusqu'à Discovery qui est, sauf erreur de ma part, un autre nom de navette, il n'y avait pas, y compris en termes prométhéens, une articulation possible entre ces deux montages mythologiques, si on veut, le champignon d'un côté et la fusée de l'autre, qui, au bout du compte, lorsqu'une fusée démarre, c'est une sorte de champignon à l'envers aussi. Et c'est évidemment la même époque, les V2, etc.
And the clouds that the shuttles made. So, in terms of scientific accomplishment, is there any relation between these two kind of imagined?
Oh, Challenger.
Challenger.
Oh. Okay.
Not the explosion of the Challenger, but the cloud when there is the lift up. Of
Yeah. The
launcher explodes.
But we're talking just the ordinary launch, and well, yes. The launchings are a ritual performance by NASA and the local community. And so, I mean, this is a regular event in the U.S. where people go to the launchings and set up their cameras and get the blast. And there are remarkable photos of some of these liftoffs and so forth. Curiously, I mean, none of them achieved anything like iconic status. You only see them as depictions of the liftoff at the time of the liftoff. And they aren't used more generally as signs of scientific progress or anything else. And so and of course, one of the key features of the icon is that it comes to signify more than its actual or initial referent. Okay. So I think they're continuous as they're part of this general discourse of scientific progress through rocketry and other explosive means, but it would be a reinforcing image.
Une autre question de Martha Langford. Peut-être une dernière, à moins qu'il y en ait une autre après. On verra.
I wondered if I could nibble a little bit at the iconicity here and take us to another place. Because I think you're well placed to answer a question that's troubled me for some time. The representation in National Geographic of Bikini Atoll and the build-up to the explosion there, which, to summarize for people who are not familiar with the article, is a very patient exploration of the population. It exposes their acceptance of the greater good, that they must leave this place so that it can be blown to smithereens by this experimental explosion. I'm not telling you this, I'm just telling other people. And, you know, they go and look at their grave sites and so forth and say goodbye. And then the end of the article says, you know, they hope that they will one day be able to return, and it's all sort of left open. And of course, we know that National Geographic and the American government were effectively one. And this article was produced by the Army photographers. So to make a long question short, why the hell did they release that story? Do we understand the genesis of that story, which runs very much counter to the program of iconicity and abstraction that you have so well developed for us today, that history? It seems to be just a rupture in the program. Do you know more about it? Can you say something about it?
Well, about the specific story, no, John may, but the part of, I mean, just briefly, my guess is, there are two things. One, the first known accident involved a Japanese fisherman. Okay, and so it immediately was an international incident. The government of Japan was not pleased about this, and the fact that we still were running Japan was neither here nor there, because it was very important to maintain the idea that they were in fact a sovereign nation, and so it immediately became clear that everything couldn't be covered up. Okay. Second of all, I think it's a far more effective strategy to have controlled representation, okay, of the accidents than to try to absolutely, suppress them. I mean, that's just not how propaganda works in, the free society. And so yes, you can look back and you can see that there are these, occasional moments. And part of what's happened now, of course, is they loom much larger in public consciousness. Okay, so a lot of the archive is no longer censored. The Marshall Islands maintains a website, and on so forth on compensation, and there are any number of ways in which the sort of government responsibility is now being articulated. But I think the comparison case that's also is that of the so-called downwinders in the U.S., okay, those populations that were irradiated by the testing at Yucca Flats and elsewhere. And that's a long, very sad story of people trying to obtain visual representation, legal representation, so forth, and finally succeeding in getting some coverage 30 and 40 years later, but who cares by then? I mean, it never is able to make a dent on this. So I think it's better to have some admission, and then the third point would be it would take a lot of bodies a lot of ruptures to disrupt the aesthetic power of the icon.
I think that there's a couple things. One, of course, is that you know, National Geographic had a set genre for how they did these things, kinds of stories, right? And it was basically, it was a very, you know, basic story. Here's this primitive culture, you know, see how, you know, exotic, you know, they are. And of course, they're not quite up to Western ways of living, and we'll make things better for them in the long run. And so there was, I think, so part of the and I'm not saying that, it's a part of the genre kind of, you know, leaked out there and drove the story along. And part of it was, I think, the Cold War sensibility that, again, this was going to make the world better somehow, right? And these were just primitive people, for God's sake. I mean, right? And we're going to move them, right? You know, we're going to take care of them. I mean, what do you want? Right? I mean, so I think that was part of the sensibility of all of that. And so I think there was kind of an arrogance about it that kind of drove it. So what you see as worrisome, they would have seen as this is an opportunity to show how great we are.
I see it as worrisome, but I'm sure many people of goodwill saw it as worrisome. They didn't have to be told. But what I find so fascinating about it is that there's the icon, and then there's also how you can make it fit. I mean, maybe this is my panel tomorrow, but how you can make it fit into any particular, you know, media formula. Okay, so now, as you've just explained, that is the way National Geographic does business, and so forth. So it's just, I just thought it was very interesting, as you know, you could almost create all around this the kind of rupture effect of how everyone was doing business with this, but in their own way. So, thank you.
By the way, I would say I think National Geographic is still what it is, but is a much different and better magazine today than it was. And the difference is the way they responded to the book, reading National Geographic. And so that's a very nice example of a scholarly intervention in, you know, public culture.
Which was how?
Which is
how did they respond to reading National Geographic?
Positively, and in part because the authors worked with what? Adaptively. I mean, you can see that they no longer use some of the conventions that were exposed in the Orientalist conventions to the extent that they did, that they've become much more politically oriented and progressively oriented and so forth. And so, you know, I mean, well, it's still National Geographic. I mean, it's not, yeah, well, it's, you know, it's not the Nation. But I think, I mean, you can go through and you can identify the change in visual conventions, and I think I would say they're for the better. So, and it's in part because the people doing the book didn't just do the book; they were working with the editorial staff and with the board as they did it and subsequently.
Bien, alors je vais maintenant vous inviter à prendre une courte pause puisque nous avons du travail et surtout du plaisir qui nous attend tout à l'heure. Donc, une pause d'une dizaine de minutes et on reprendra donc vers moins 10. Et merci encore une fois. Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, John.